Okay, welcome to the second video lecture for this week. I'm going to try and keep this one to just under 15 minutes because we had three other videos that ran, almost 45 minutes. And between that and dinner, there's only so much contact hours I can take up from you this week. So I'm going to go through a little bit of material today that should be in the back of your mind as you read about Spence's description of what's happening to China politically in the 1980s in the lead up to the challenge from students and from the residents of Beijing and from intellectuals that culminates in a gathering at Tiananmen Square that eventually is met with severe government repression and leads to a period that kind of for a year or months disrupts much of China's interaction with the outside world. So what I want to keep in the back of your mind then is what's happening outside Asia that's influencing the decision makers inside China, like Deng Xiaoping, but also a source of inspiration to students and to activists and to intellectuals like Feng Lizhi, the man who's talking about greater democratization in China, about greater academic freedom. And that's these currents of democratization that are happening in neighboring states in Asia, but also throughout the world, as well as alternatives to democratization. So you see here in the late 1980s, what's happening in China is colored by events in South Korea. We have an authoritarian regime that's been in power since the end of the Second World War in South Korea. And we have a military general who seized power in the 1980s, and he removes himself from office and allows for a process by which political parties are formed and direct elections are held. Similarly, in Taiwan, we have something happen, and I'm going to go into deeper detail in Taiwan in a second. Alternatively, we also have the dissolving of the Soviet Union, which worries China because in terms of territory, in terms of heritage and history, Russia and the Soviet Union have much more in common with China than perhaps these small states do, even though they share a Confucian tradition or a Chinese identity in the case of Taiwan. And so watching this happen to the Soviet Union, you have hardliners within the Chinese Communist Party who are opposed to these reforms or opposed to greater loosening of controls over things like free speech and political participation, pointing to what's happening in the Soviet Union and saying this is going to lead to their downfall. And these debates continue. That's what's so important about this topic is South Korea, Taiwan, what happens to the Soviet Union in this period. Chinese scholars, historians, economists, political scientists, all people interested in politics, they all study what happens in these countries and use that as a point of reference in debates about what happens in China, not just in the late 1980s, but today. If you go to the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, people are still studying those to take away some kind of lesson, some kind of meaning for China. And then it's also important to remember, and this is something I'm going to expand on next week when we talk about Tiananmen in class on Monday, it's the appearance of this alternative route in Singapore, where you have an ethnic Chinese leader in power, Lee Kuan Yew, and his party, which is a one-party state, that has created this bargain that looks appealing to Deng Xiaoping, where Lee Kuan Yew's political philosophy is if you reward people materially, if the economy is strong and people's lives materially are getting better, or their standard of living is being raised, they will find comfort. They will passively accept totalitarian regimes and the suppression of dissent or criticism. And then lastly, what's happening in Hong Kong and the development of what's known as one country, two systems is really integral to the relationship between a democratic Taiwan and a still one-party, ideologically communist state in Beijing. And it becomes this means where perhaps the civil war can be resolved diplomatically, but the willingness of people in Taiwan, of both the government and the people there, to resume being a part of China and not be de facto independent, largely is being weighed against what happened in Tiananmen Square in 1989, but also what people can perceive to be happening when Beijing resumes control over Hong Kong, when the British relinquish their lease and Hong Kong is allowed to, or is given back to China. Okay, so the one that we really want to focus on then is So I got a typo here. Philippines. Okay, so the one we really want to focus on in Taiwan. A brief summary of Taiwan is that, from what we can tell from anthropologists and historians, Taiwan was first settled by a group of hunter-gatherers that arrived from different parts in China, Southeast Asia, and the Philippines over 6,000 years ago. And then slowly, this small population of what we consider to be Taiwanese ethnically is overwhelmed by waves of mainlanders, people from mainland China, Han and Hakka pioneers, who begin coming over as early as the Sui dynasty, and then continue in another burst in the Ming dynasty, and then in later bursts in the Qing dynasty, until around 1811, there's about 2 million people living in Taiwan. There's a great deal of intermarriage between these groups, Han, Hakka, and native Taiwanese, until they kind of basically assimilate. And we get what now people refer to as the native Taiwanese, the people that are going to be living there when the government of Chiang Kai-shek is defeated in the Civil War in 1949 and then exiles what was the Republic of China into Taipei. Okay? This is an area that's long been integral to China's relationships with the outside world because some of the first Europeans to arrive via the oceans on China's borders land here. For instance, the Portuguese come, and they're the ones that are going to give the island of Taiwan its name, Formosa, which means something like beautiful island in 1591. They're kind of pushed out by the Dutch East India Company, who struggles with the Spanish for control over the island, which they establish until this group of Ming loyalists comes over in the mid-17th century and then pushes them out. The French will also use this place as a base of operations during the late Opium Wars. And so that kind of takes on the second distinctive characteristic, which both are raised in significance when Japan colonizes it after 1895. And that's that a great deal of commerce, piracy, smuggling, is run via Taiwan into mainland China in the south. And then also a great number of foreign powers use the island as a base of operations, as a temporary holding station in order to project power into mainland China. And that includes the French. It includes a failed Ming loyalist coup or struggle against the Manchu. It includes Japan, which after they colonized the island in 1895 began making improvements to infrastructure, rails, and networks. And actually, there's a great deal of rising living standards, a considerable economic infrastructure that's established by the Japanese, as well as the natives kind of take to the colonizers' culture, cuisine, and fashion, and actually kind of even after the Second World War, look much more warmly upon the Japanese than, say, mainland Chinese do. Okay. So then, as I mentioned, Chiang Kai-shek flees southward and takes with him the government of the Kuomintang, which then is installed in kind of a provincial form in Taiwan. And with them go around 2 million mainlanders during the Civil War. And they're going to form a dominant majority in the group. The idea for this, in part, comes from the Ming Dynasty, where you had a Ming loyalist, a general Zhang Zhongzhang, okay, who is not able to stomach Manchu rule, and so then he exiles himself on Taiwan, and from there he hopes to build up his army, build up support, and then reinvade the mainland and take back control from the Manchu. He fails, and in fact his son loses control of the island in 1683. But we see a similar idea with Chiang Kai-shek. From here, this is only a temporary base of operations, which in part explains kind of the severe, strict, tight military type society that's built by Chiang Kai-shek on the island in the 1950s and 1960s. Because he wants to use this to make raids, which the Army of the Republic of China does against mainland, although it becomes more and more likely that they'll never regain control of the mainland. What's established then is a very strong military regime with generous amounts of American aid, as you can see, that has a mutual defense treaty following the Korean War, that creates a martial law society. Martial law is in effect in Taiwan from the 1950s on up until 1987. And that means no opposition parties are allowed. There's restrictions of press, public assembly. All contact with the mainland is closed. So you're not allowed to read newspapers or listen to radio broadcasts or send mail to relatives. and certainly all travel and exchange in terms of business is banned. What Zhang Jieshi does very successfully, though, is this time listen to American advisors and enact successful land reform, and using that American aid, integrate Taiwan into the global capitalist economy. And so we see a couple of things. One, Taiwan very quickly becomes an export economy that first is focused on the export of sugar, and then later manufacture, and then later technologies and electronics. And then higher material standards, and then also a population boom. Again, kind of a much smaller level than China, but the population doubles by the 1970s, where there is around 14.6 million people. The struggles of Taiwan and Taipei are largely the same as Beijing in the 1970s, and that is how to deal with their relationship with the Americans, how to deal with succession, because the Generalissimo is dying, and Zhang Jingguo, his son, is named premier in 1972. And he's left to deal with the fact that his father, through decades of martial law, has really alienated much of the general populace. Most of the people living on the island, the larger indigenous Taiwanese groups, are kind of discriminated. They're in the lowest levels of the workforce. They have less education, far fewer privileges than the mainlanders that came over with the Kuomintang. Okay? And then secondly, all these diplomatic challenges. Taiwan has lost its UN seat. It's losing diplomatic recognition from more and more countries after the U.S. moves its embassy to Beijing. Many others do. And it no longer has a U.S. defense treaty. So it's really in trouble. And most importantly, the thing that Zhang Jieshi kind of hung his hat on, the justification for martial law and strict control over society, the idea that the Kuomintang could retake the mainland, that's out the window once the United States kind of says that Taiwan is more on its own. But then what we see is incredibly surprising series of events in the 1980s that I'm going to refer to as Zhang's Revolution, because it's so unlikely, where, like Deng Xiaoping, a series of reforms are enacted that changes Taiwan's foreign relations. One, by unofficially allowing for the resumption of ties with Beijing. There's a removal of travel restrictions. Now families are being reunited on the basis of the families. We get new business partnerships and communication systems linking up the two countries. And then also by positioning Taiwan as a still formidable ally, they secure the Taiwan Relations Act, which basically strengthens their position by making sure that the U.S. will continue to sell them arms. And even though it won't have embassies or diplomatic recognition, it's going to give them all the equivalencies diplomatically and politically of a nation state. Domestically, this is where the surprises come in. Most Americans, most experts on Asia looked at Zhang Jieshi as a typical authoritarian ruler like his father. But towards the end of his career in the late 1980s, he enacts a series of reforms that begin to show that he too wants to experiment with political liberalization. He names a vice president who's a native Taiwanese, Li Tenghui. He was an agriculturalist trained under the Japanese. He wages a very, very severe anti-corruption campaign that even targets friends of his father, and takes out a great number of people who have had positions. And then he also forces the retirement of a number of people who came over with Kuomintang, who have long lived past their credential in government and their use. He also allows for greater public criticism. He releases political prisoners. And we see kind of a spawn of debates about the Kuomintang, about relations with China, that's taking place in the universities, medias, and streets. That's in many ways a parallel to what's happening inside mainland China. And then finally, I'm going to try and wrap up these two things before I have to cut this video short, because we have to use 15-minute exhibits, is while sometimes still using arbitrary arrests and squashing parties, he begins to tolerate the actions of a group that are going to become known as the Democratic Progressive Party, a loyal opposition party that begins to run for seats in legislative councils and win. And he basically doesn't use any of the state's controls to force them out of these positions, as his father would have, until eventually he even lifts martial law in 1987. He's going to die then towards the end of his career, and many people speculate this is kind of the reason why he felt free to do so. We'll pick up the rest in the next video.